Hi guys, it's Sophia from ATAR Notes, and today I'm presenting the HSC Business Studies April lecture. So this is all part of our lecture series this school holidays. At ATAR Notes, we offer heaps of free resources. We've got study notes, we've got lectures every school holidays. Our lectures this year are all throughout the week, so you can sign up for other ones if you haven't already. We've got our online discussions, engaging revision videos, newsletters, the ATAR calculator, articles about study strategy, tips, uni, all of that, and heaps more on our website, atarnotes.com. And other than that, we also have other resources, including TuteSmart, which is our online tutoring program. We offer private and class tutoring sessions. We've got our study guides, which are the printed revision materials full of notes and topic tests. And then if you're not into having the printed version, we do have Ed Unlimited, which has all of our books, topic tests, and guides all in one place on one website. So you can check that out on our website too if you're interested. I want to give a special thanks to our sponsors. We've got La Trobe, RMIT, Deakin, UTS, and Macquarie for sponsoring this lecture series. And let's get started. So a little bit about me. So some of you guys might have joined some of the other lectures throughout this week if you were at the Modern History or Studies of Religion one. Otherwise, you might have come to other lecture series or been to a business studies lecture with me before. Others might recognize me from the ATAR Notes TikTok. I recently started creating content, and I've done a few business studies videos. But if you've never seen me before, my name's Sophia. I graduated in 2021 with a 96.3 ATAR. These are some of my marks. I was very much on the humanities side of like subjects. But the one that matters for this lecture is my 95 in business. And I'm studying a Bachelor of Education at the University of Sydney to teach English and Business Studies at high school. So fun. Live, laugh, love business studies. We're in for a ride, guys. Gonna try to get to 2 hours. You're gonna love this because we're doing finance. We're doing finance. I think I've only posted like 2 or 3 TikToks about business. But every single time the comments are all about how everyone hates finance. And don't worry, I hated finance, and I had some beef. I really didn't love finance. I wasn't really a math student, clearly from my subjects. And I don't know, I feel like after you do marketing or after you do HR, nothing's going to hit the same. And I think especially if you started with marketing or HR and then you go to finance, it's just not it. If you guys haven't done finance yet, this is going to be a great introduction. Obviously we're trying to get through as much content as possible. So we picked out some of the hardest dot points from role, influences, processes, and strategies. So it's got a lot of the content, but at the same time, it's not the full syllabus. It's most of it. I've also got case studies from Qantas in here as well. And if you have done finance, you can use this as a revision to brush up on your notes. All of these slides are downloadable, guys. So if you go below the live chat, there should be a resource button where you can download these slides and have a copy of them, come back to them. This lecture is also recorded. So if you get tired halfway through, you're bored, you already feel good with role and influences and you only want strategies, or you got to go, all good to leave. This is recorded and you guys will have access to these recordings up until your HSC. So you're going to have them for the rest of the year. Absolutely no stress. But yeah, we're going to go through most of the finance topic. Very fun. So whether you've started or you've already finished it, it'll be an either good revision or great introduction to it. I'm going to try and make it as simple as possible because I think finance is the hardest topic of business. I don't think that's like an unpopular opinion at all. It gets very full on, and I feel like compared to marketing and HR, with which a lot of us have pretty good knowledge of just generally, and I feel like a lot of marketing as well, a lot of it you can kind of just waffle, and a lot of it's kind of common sense because we're so exposed to marketing in our world. Finance, not so much. So I feel like that's why it's a lot more of a struggle, but we're going to try and get through it. And I'm also going to include my business studies tips and just talk a little bit about studying for business because it just needs to be talked about. I actually wanted to start with that only because I'm going to be live in the Q&A chat throughout this entire lecture. So any questions while we're going through, and it can be anything with business, like anything to do with business, even if it's a marketing question, if it's an operations question, just keep it coming. I'm going to answer them. Even if it's not business, if it's just HSC or anything in general, I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have in the live chat. So please leave them because I'm literally just going to be sitting there waiting for questions to answer. But I wanted to start a bit on surviving business studies, how to make the most of it, scaling in business studies, and all of that, because it's not spoken about enough. And I feel like when it is spoken about, it's business studies isn't given justice. So let's start with scaling for business, because there's this stigma that business studies scales horribly, and even if you do really well, you're just going to get scaled down, but it's not true. The reality is that a lot of students pick business studies because they think it's just going to be easy. And I'm sure a lot of you guys already can see that business isn't that easy, or as easy as a lot of people make it out to be. I think in comparison to some other content subjects, business, a lot of the information in business studies, like especially marketing and HR, and especially HR, if you've ever, or if you guys are already working, I feel like a lot of it is stuff that we're already used to. But business isn't easy in terms of the extent of content. Also, some of the topics like finance and operations, for example, not very easy content. And then applying it in the exam is quite lengthy. So in that sense, it's not easy. But because a lot of students picking it thinking it'll be easy, and then they find out it's not, they're bringing the average really low, which means that the average for business studies isn't that high. The good part of that is that as long as you're above that average, the scaling is all the way up. So as long as you can break even into those higher up bands, you're all good with business. And that's fortunately not too hard to do if you're studying the smart way. So let's talk about studying for business. I think that if you go into business studies and you have the mindset like, oh, even if I do well, I'm not going to do well because it's business, business scales bad. And that's a lot of what everyone's talking about online. Just try to block it out. I promise you, business does not scale bad. It was actually one of my best scaling subjects, even though I did Extension 1 English and modern history, which, you know, are known to be better scaling like humanities and like English subjects. Business still ended up being one of my best subjects, even though business studies was essentially one of the worst subjects that I was doing. So trust issues online. We don't trust it. Trust that if you do well in business, scaling is not going to affect you. And that's kind of how it is for every subject. If you're hitting the higher bands, it doesn't matter. Scaling really, really matters when you're in the average kind of band and you're falling into the average, which I will not let any of you fall into. And then scaling matters more for those really high scaling subjects, like physics and extension 2 maths, where it's really going to pull up your mark because of that average. Otherwise, don't worry too much about it. I feel like there's a lot of talk about scaling, and I fell into the trap too. And I used to think like, oh, it's business, like who cares? Like even if I do well, it won't scale. Not true. Not true. I don't want any of you guys to believe it. So if you have any questions about scaling, ask in the box and we'll talk about it. But trust, pulling your weight in business is going to pay off. Let's talk about studying for business. The syllabus is everything. The syllabus is absolutely everything. It's absolutely everything. I cannot tell you how many questions and like past questions I've done across the entire paper, from multiple choice, from short answer, and from the business report and essays, where they literally just take the question word for word from the learn tos or the learn abouts. So a lot of the time, especially in multiple choice, you'll find that you don't even need to know what some of the content means. They'll just like copy and paste like syllabus dot points, and you just have to fill in or like select them from A, B, C, D. So I think memorizing the syllabus is so important. It's going to help you across every section of the exam, especially in finance. If you guys have already done finance, you'll know that with the different strategies, like in your business report, for an example, they can say like recommend a strategy for this business, but they won't always specify which strategy you should use. But especially in finance and across the other topics too, there's always going to be certain strategies that are better suited for different processes and different business scenarios. So if you memorize your syllabus, then you'll be able to identify those a lot easier. And that goes for short answer as well, just being able to like match the point to the question. And that can only really be done with memorizing the syllabus. So in terms of how to memorize the syllabus, I printed them out. I put them on my walls. You know when like you see people with all like papers on their walls? I wasn't bothered actually writing notes, so I just put my syllabus on my wall. If you have the syllabus on your wall, or you've got like a printed copy with you somewhere, I think it's really good just to have it, just so you're looking at it and you're just exposed to it as much as possible. Other than that, reading over it, I'm gonna actually post a TikTok with fill in the blanks, because that was one thing that my teacher made us do. and it was like where you fill in the blanks of like missing syllabus words, and that really helped me learn it. But I also had the syllabus on flashcards, and I just kind of read them, and I know it's like, oh, it's just the syllabus, but for other subjects the syllabus doesn't serve as much as a purpose, and it's much more just a guide. For business studies, it's the base. The business studies syllabus is so packed and so full on, but everything you need is there. It's got all the points that you need. It's the summary. You should be structuring your notes around the syllabus dot points. The learn tos are direct questions that they'll use in the short answers, and then also in extended responses. So we got to trust it. It's sacred. It is so important in business studies, and I feel like it made a really big difference with my marks, even though it was like just like memorizing the syllabus. Like, it sounds dumb to say it, but trust me, it's going to help you. Another thing in business studies, after you finish your notes, make a summary and a shortened version of them and make them as simplistic as possible. So have summarized notes. I don't personally recommend going in with like 40 pages of notes for finance, 40 pages for operations, 40 pages for marketing. Because when you stand outside like your trial, like examination room, and when you like are right about to sit your HSC, the last thing you want to do is be flicking through like all these notes trying to find like one point, or like you doubt one section and you're trying to find and you've got all these notes. The shorter your notes are by the end, the better. So you don't have to worry about it too much. You guys are halfway through now. But I think that in business, it's much more quality over quantity. And the more notes that you have, I think the more confusing you can get, and you kind of just overload. Realistically, when you're looking at the exam, the way that it's structured, you've got 20 multiple choice, you've got 40 marks of short answer, but even in that 40 marks, you're only going to have 10 marks per topic. So 10 for finance, 10 for marketing, 10 for HR, and 10 for operations. And then you're going to have a 20-mark business report, which will be across two topics. So maybe operations, marketing, finance, HR, whichever the two is. And then a 20-mark case study essay on the opposite two topics. So when you actually look at that in detail, one topic you're only going to answer 15 marks of questions for, and 5 of those will be multiple choice, 10 will be short answers. So do you really need that many notes? Like, do you really need that many notes if you're only going to answer 15 marks worth for one topic? And for the other topics, it is great to have notes and it's great to know as much as possible, but I just don't want any of you guys overloading on business and going out of your way to study everything like to an absolute T and know everything inside and out when you're not going to be assessed on absolutely everything. I just think that that's not the most efficient way to study, and it's definitely studying harder rather than studying smarter. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but just to maximize your time and also to make sure you're not putting too much time into business studies and sacrificing your other subjects. Having summarized notes is so much more important. And if anything, if you're going to have long notes on topics that you don't, and like dot points that you don't feel confident with. If you feel really confident on a dot point, why do you have 3 pages of notes for it? You don't necessarily need that. You can condense that into one and really try to make summary notes. So I'm not going to say like, oh, 10 notes, 15 notes. Like, it's up to you guys how shortened you want them to be. But for the most effective study by the end, just to make it easier for yourself, the shorter your notes, the better. In terms of note taking as well, it's a little bit controversial. Everyone talks about note taking differently. Notes, I think, in business studies are really good, but you don't want to stop there. You don't want to just write your notes and that's all the study you do, because you definitely want to practice applying those notes to how you're going to be assessed. And my big thing with how I was studying for HSC was in every subject, I had like my content, I learnt my content, and then I was practicing it specifically in the way that I was going to be assessed on the exams. So instead of stopping at my business studies notes, as soon as I had learnt those notes, I was doing multiple choice practice questions, I was doing short answer questions, and I was doing practice business reports and case study essays. That way you're taking your notes and what you've learnt and applying them the way that they're going to be assessed on the day in your trials and in your HSC. So when you go into your HSC and trials, it's not the first time that you have to apply your notes. That's personally what I recommend. But in terms of note taking, it's really up to you what you'd like to do. I don't think there's any issue with using other people's notes. We're literally ATAR notes, and I had the ATAR notes business studies book, and a lot of my notes I was just using from that book, but also from notes online. There's nothing essentially wrong with that. If you're not a fan of like writing your own notes, 100% you can take other people's and learn them. It's really what suits you. Another thing with note taking that I just want to quickly talk about is there's a lot of like stigma around the way that you write notes and how focused you are when you write notes. I know that sometimes I would like need complete silence, like fully focused. And while I was writing my notes, I was actually teaching myself the content. Other times I wouldn't be bothered. I'd have my Spotify on. I'd be on FaceTime with a friend. I'd be in my free periods. like talking with my mates and like be typing up notes, or I'd have like Netflix on in the background and I'm like just copying notes from like a textbook or from someone else's notes. There's no issue with either of those. Of course, the more focused you can be writing your notes and if you can be teaching them, that's great. But at the end, you're going to get the same product. And if you are finding it heavy, there's a lot of content in business to be fully switched on 100% of the time, keeping up on your notes. So I think that you should not feel guilty if you're falling into the pattern where you're just taking note taking really light, you're just focused on getting everything down. You guys are still halfway, so you have time to learn them and apply them. And again, notes shouldn't be anything more than the base. By the end of it, you really want to be working on past papers and practice questions, and that's something you guys can build up to with time. So yeah, no hate. We have no hate for certain ways of studying. I don't want to discredit any way of studying, but I also don't want you guys to think and fall into the trap that unless you're studying this certain way and unless you're fully focused writing notes and you're writing your complete own notes and you take nothing from online, nothing from anywhere else, that you're not going to get a band 6 in business. That's not how it works. And that's not how it works across any subject. I really believe that there's an issue with how studying is portrayed online, and even what I was watching on TikTok, on YouTube, on like all these study articles that I would read while I was in year 12. A lot of the advice was like, oh, you need to be studying this many hours this each week for this subject and sort it out this way and wake up at this time and do this many hours of study a day. Listen, I think with business studies it's really a matter of studying smarter, not harder. And I think business studies is one of the best subjects that you can do that. So yeah, I think having those notes as a base, and no matter how you write them, as long as you're learning them by the end of them, it's all good. No judgment here. In terms of actually learning the content, I recommend flashcards for terminology, ratios, and case studies. I think that, especially because, I don't know, I was one of those ones. I had different color flashcards for the different topics. And you like highlight them, you get them all aesthetic, like you can organize them and tell yourself you're studying. There's different ways you can study for business studies, but I feel like flashcards are a really great way for memorizing. Because there was so much content, and I'm gonna sound absolutely insane talking about this, but I've seen it on TikTok that other students are using this technique, and it really worked for me. Because there's so much content for business studies, one thing you guys can try is teaching others. Teaching others is one of the best study techniques, I think, because if you can teach other people it, you best believe you can answer like a 4 or 5 mark question on it. And on top of teaching others, you can also identify where you don't know something very well. Like as you're teaching it to your friends, for example, in a free period, or like the person you sit next to, like just explain the content to them. If they ask you a question that you don't know the answer on, that actually shows you that you don't know it too well. So then you can go back to your notes and relearn it. You can ask your teacher, you can watch some online videos, go to textbooks, find the answer, and brush up on your own knowledge. So not only is it giving you confidence that, oh, I know this topic really well, I can teach it to others, I can explain to others, but it's also showing you spots that you lack and where you have some flawed knowledge to then go back to. So I really recommend that method. Now, the issue with that method that I don't feel like enough people talk about is teaching others is great until they don't want to be taught anymore. And I feel like in your subjects, and I use this technique across all of my subjects, but I can't tell like one of my friends doing like chem. I'm not going to be like, hey, do you want me to teach you, like, do you want me to teach you the financial processes, or do you want me to teach you the financial strategy of working capital management? Like, they don't actually care. They don't actually care. So that's an issue there where if you, like, what if your friends already know the content really well? What if they don't want to hear it? What if you don't want to sound too repetitive? The way to get over that, and it comes at the cost of your sanity and at the cost of your self-esteem. But 2 ways that I got over that. One way, it sounds psychotic, but I would go onto like my camera, like on my phone, and I would just record myself and just speak to my camera as if I was like teaching. And I'd sometimes go for like 1 hour. Like this girl would not shut up, but I would just explain all the content to myself and just kind of talk to myself. And because it was being recorded, I felt a bit more validated than just sitting here and talking to myself. And if I wasn't doing that, this also probably sounds even crazier, but I had an animated photo of like a classroom of like kids, but they were not actual kids, but like animated, on my wall. And then I would just sit and talk to them as if I was explaining the content to them, as if I was like a teacher, which I think I just manifested my reality because now I'm studying teaching and I'm starting to become a business studies teacher. So she really manifested there. But those two techniques really worked for me because sometimes people don't want to hear it, and I didn't want to go on and on teaching others. I could just delete the videos after. You got to obviously clear up some storage on your phone to do those long videos. But I've seen on TikTok that other students are doing that as well, and I think it's a really great study technique, not just for business, but for content subjects in general. If you can explain it to yourself, it really helps your confidence and shows you what you know best and what you don't know, and then that can expose where you have to go back to. So we love that. I really recommend that, and that can really show you which syllabus points you feel best with and which you need to brush up on. I think the best study combo is starting with notes and then past papers and practice questions. You guys aren't at a point yet where I even recommend past papers. I don't think you guys should start doing past papers until you finish all the content. If anything, you can try multiple choice questions, but you guys can't even do all of the multiple choice sections yet. And like, you could if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be as effective as when you finished all the topics yet. So unless you guys are very close to that, I wouldn't actually recommend past papers yet. I know a lot of the advice is, oh, do past papers. Past papers is the best study. Past papers is the best study when you can sit them in full and when you feel confident in the content. Otherwise, I don't really recommend it yet. If anything, practice questions and specific multiple choice questions on topics that you've done, specific like the 10 marks from the short answers on marketing if you've done marketing, or operations if you've done operations. Just going to specific parts rather than forcing yourself to do the paper and just kind of guess. And if you don't feel too confident on the section, still doing it. I'm not a very big advocate of that. Also with past papers, especially the first few ones you guys sit, do not be fooled and do not feel guilty if you have like your notes open next to you. I remember the first few past papers I did, I had my notes with me, and I remember telling some of my friends that. My friends were like, oh, what's the point of even doing it? Like, that's not even a proper past paper. But there's no right or wrong way to study, and I started like that, and with time was completely fine doing like a 3-hour past paper on my own. And same with other study techniques. I feel like there's a lot of stigma, and it's like, unless you study like this, even like when I'd like be on FaceTime doing notes, or I'd like be listening to music, doing my notes, like a lot of the online conversation is, unless you're doing it this certain way, it's not effective study. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. There's different ways you can study. There's obviously the most effective study, and there's light ways of studying, like passive studying, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad studying. In my head, study is study. And it's much better to start with light study and build into heavier study than to not study at all, or to, even worse, force yourself into a studying technique that doesn't work for you. So this is just your reminder, and this is just your confirmation. And I'm only saying this because I wish that I heard it when I was in year 12, that there is no ideal, you have to study this way, this is the only way you're going to get a band 6. I got a 95 in business, and I started off doing past papers with my notes like on my laptop open right next to me, with my syllabus right next to me. I was listening to my Spotify like playlists, and I would have Netflix on in the background, typing up notes, copying notes from other notes and using other people's notes, but also notes from textbooks, everything. It's fine. I used other people's case studies. It's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't mean that you're destined for failure, or that you're just going to fall into the average. I promise, using study techniques that work for you is always going to result in success, I believe, because instead of forcing yourself to study how other people are telling you to study or how you're supposed to study, it's not going to do the trick. It's not going to do the trick. I think reading exemplar business reports, case essays, and sample answers are good as well, just because you can kind of see in your mind how they're structured and kind of take notes. I liked to read exemplar business reports and case essays because I would take, and I recommend this for English as well and other content subjects that you're writing essays, I would take things that I liked that they did from one, and then I'd go to another, and I'd be like, oh, I like how they used the headings here. I liked how they separated their paragraphs. I liked that they used dot points, or how they drew this table, or they did like a mind map in this. And I would take different parts from different exemplars and then build my own. And I found that that really increased my marks because I was making the most use of the business reports and the case essays. I think case essays as well, because you're using the evidence from the case studies. It's good to read exemplars and just find out what other people are doing. And naturally, as you're reading them, you'll find what suits you, and then you'll build your own style that is a mix of what you're already doing and what other high exemplar students are doing. So you can build this really nice style that's going to work for you. And then that's the same with sample answers, just figuring out how to structure responses and how they're starting, and just kind of building that concise information, that concise response, I think is really great. So that's my little my little rant on studying for business studies. I'm sorry that that went long. I hope you guys are asking questions in the live chat, anything about studying for business studies, because I feel like across HSC, I don't think there's enough talk on how to study for specific subjects. I think it's just how to study overall. But studying for business studies is very different than studying for math, or than studying for English, or than studying for a science subject. There's so many different ways of studying. And I think another flaw is that when we are talking about study online and a lot of the advice that's coming out, a lot of it's like, you should do this amount of hours a day, you should study this way. And it's very big on that ideal picture that if you want this mark, this is how you have to do it. Not true. And in saying this, all this advice that this is what I was using to get a band 6, but there's other people who are doing the opposite, and there's other people who will tell you only do past papers, don't even rely on notes, that'll get you a band 6. Everyone's going to give you different advice. My advice is coming from a place where I felt guilty because I wasn't following that like typical ideal student, and because I wasn't in that era and I wasn't doing this amount of study for business each week, and I wasn't getting as many past papers as I thought I had to done, I had this idea that I just wasn't going to do that well in business studies. So when I ended up with a 95, I was actually pretty surprised. I was aiming for a band 6, but after the exam, I was like, oh, high band 5, low band 6. I wasn't expecting a 95 at all. And I think a big reason to that is because I was so stuck in this comparative mindset, and I was so like consumed by just the idea and like the perfectionism of how you have to study all of that. So I wish I heard this in year 12, and I don't know if this is going to help anyone, but hopefully it can help a few of you. Study what works for you. Don't feel guilty for not studying how everyone else is studying, and definitely don't listen to what other people are saying. I had friends who were like, oh, I can't believe you'd leave this last minute, or I can't believe you'd study this way. I can't believe you'd just trust other people's notes. Do what works for you. Do what works for you. Trust in what works for you, and you'll see the outcome. Another thing, it is school holidays now, and by the time you guys are watching this, it'll be, yeah, around halfway of school holidays. If you have not gotten any work done, or if you have gotten barely any work done, do not feel bad. Do not feel bad at all, I promise you. Again, a lot of the advice online is spend your school holidays, get on top of everything, all of that. My advice is take it chill. I think it's so good to have a break. And if you have been on top of your study, that's great as well. But again, there's no one way that you have to do year 12. And if you don't do it like this, there's no way you're going to get a good ATAR. Trying to get out of that mindset is so important of year 12, because it can really affect your mental health and your sanity, and it just really makes you feel like you're not doing enough. And that's one of the worst feelings when you're actually trying. You guys are halfway through year 12, so if you haven't gotten as much work done, or you've wanted to do more study and you haven't been able to, don't feel bad. It's so important that you guys have a break and that you have some time off. The fact that all of you guys are here, whether you're watching this live at the time that it's premiered, or you're watching a recording of it, or you've just come to download the slides, either way, the fact that you put in your email and you signed up for this shows how dedicated you are to your studies, even if you don't believe it. So trust me, I'm very proud of all of you. Thank you for coming and for signing up. Either way, if you're watching the recording or if you're watching it live when it's premiered. But it's school holidays. Take a break. If you're struggling to get started with study, and I'm happy to answer any questions on this in the live chat. If you're struggling to get started with study, my advice is to start really light, and that's like start writing and catching up on some notes. Have your Spotify on. Like, no issues. Who cares? It doesn't even have to be classical study music. You can just listen to your normal music, FaceTime a friend, have Netflix on in the background, watch a YouTube, listen to a podcast. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, just try to do some really light studying. And I promise, as soon as you start some of that light studying, you start to gain a bit more motivation. You see that you're getting work done. Even though it's light, it's definitely still a step up from not getting any work done. And then you can then build into that heavier study. If you have really been on your holiday grind, I respect it. I really struggled to get on like the holiday grind. If anything, while I was like, especially my April school holidays when I was in year 12, I only really got on the grind like the last couple of days, because I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm going back to school, need to get this together. And I had like my little like, I'm going to be better this term. I'm going to really try this term, everyone. Like this term, like I'm going to actually study. I'm going to get on top of it. You know how you get that motivation boost like right before you go back. But otherwise, I was studying pretty light. And I went back into the term just feeling really refreshed and ready to go. So don't feel too guilty if you haven't got any work done. If you're looking to and you're just really struggling to start, I think the best thing you can do is just starting with light study. And again, if you're like, if in your head you have that voice and it's like, oh, but what's the point? Like, it's not even proper studying. Try to get that voice out of your head. That voice is definitely influenced by just like the conversation about the ideal student and how you have to study, but it's not true. Any study is good study. Even if you've like listened to music and you like catch up on heaps of these notes, you can turn that music off, and when you feel more influenced and like more motivated to study, you can stop. You have all the notes done, and then you can learn them. Then you can turn them into flashcards. Then you can start teaching yourself, but you've already got that base done. And that base, even though you did that base in a light or in a passive way, there's nothing essentially wrong with that. And this is your reminder of that. Anyways, I'm going to stop now because I'm going on a rant. I really wanted to just start with like how to survive business studies, because I just feel like business studies just needs to be spoken about more. I hate seeing hate on business studies. Everyone on TikTok, whenever I see TikToks about business, there's just hate on business, and hate that it's like easy, and hate that it's like bad scaling. No. I don't personally think business studies is easy. I don't think it's this super hard subject. I think it's hard because of the content, but and how much of it, and also how it's assessed. Like, I think writing the business report and the case study essay, like doing both of those in 3 hours, plus the 40 marks of short answer, plus the 20 marks multiple choice, I definitely think the exam feels heavy and the content gets heavy. But the argument that it's easy and the argument that it scales bad just does nothing, doesn't achieve anything. Business studies was actually my favorite subject in year 12. That's probably like not the most popular opinion, because I see that a lot of people don't like business studies. And I didn't like it at first, but as I kept going throughout the year, I was like, damn, this isn't actually too bad. This isn't actually too bad. As soon as I realized that the syllabus is so foolproof that if you learn the syllabus inside out and you really feel confident with it, you'll find so much repetition across it. And they also haven't changed the business studies syllabus in years, like in over 10 years. So there's so many papers that you can do. The more past papers and questions that I had done with time, the more I realized they're like, a lot of the questions, they're naturally just going to repeat. So the more practice you can do. And yeah, with time, I turned into a business studies lover so much that I'm now studying to become a business studies teacher at uni. So trust that anything is possible. I hope this, I don't know if this specific lecture will help you love business studies more, because it's finance, which is one of, if not the most hated subject of business. But let's get into it, guys. I wanted to start just with some general stuff on business, just so we can start in the live chat as well, which I'll be live on answering questions throughout, just so we can start with a consensus of business, how to study for it, how to survive it, what was working for me, what helped me get my band 6, and just answer some questions. But again, anything HSC, even if it's not business studies related, if you guys have any business specific videos that you guys would like to see on the HSC Notes TikTok, I'm happy to make them. And I really want to do like some like 1 minute like summaries on like one specific strategy, or just some videos in the future. So if you guys are on TikTok, not her clouding herself. Okay, let's start with the role of finance. And the role of finance is really important, but it's more about the objectives, because the objectives come across in every single topic. So I really want us to have a very good foundation of those ones. So financial management is the planning and monitoring of a business's financial resources to enable the business to achieve its financial objectives. So the objectives and achieving those is hands down the most important part of finance, and it undermines every single part of the topic. So the overarching aim is to provide financial resources to achieve all business goals, and that links to the interdependence with other key functions. I think one of the best things about interdependence is you learn it once, and then you don't necessarily have to learn it again, because like there's always going to be an overlap. So we love interdependence. Strategy refers to long-term broad aims affecting all key business areas, and the strategic plan includes the strategies a business will use to achieve long-term goals. Strategic role of financial management is therefore to ensure that a business achieves its goals and objectives, which is done by effectively managing business's finances. So I feel like the big part of this is just having a definition of what financial management is, because a lot of your short answer responses can start with that and then build in to. So examples of the strategic role include setting financial objectives and ensuring that the business achieves these goals. sourcing finances internally and externally, preparing budgets and forecasting future finances, maintaining sufficient cash flow, and then financial resources, which is resources in a business that have monetary value. So when you look at all these are literally just the dot points. Like the role of finance and the strategic role is achieved through all the dot points. So that's why I think the role is especially important in finance, because it's really showing up across all the syllabus points. So we looked at the definition of financial management, but the main goal of finance as a key function of a business is to provide adequate financial resources to all the business functions in order to then achieve their business goals. So finance is actually financing the resources for each function, for marketing, for operations, and for HR, for them to individually achieve their goals, which naturally is achieving everyone's goals. So finance is very much the core, and they're financing all those other business functions. Let's look at interdependence. So interdependence refers to the mutual dependence that the key functions have on one another, and the functions work best when they overlap, so when all employees are working towards the common goals of the business. So marketing, operations, and HR rely on financial managers to allocate them adequate funds. Operations requires funds to purchase inputs and carry out their transformation process. Marketing requires funds to undertake the various types of promotion, and HR requires funds to pay for staff. So basically, marketing, operations, and HR go to finance and they're like, give us cash. We need money to do our job. And then finance relies on operations to produce the products. Then they rely on marketing to promote the products, and HR to manage the staff that they require to fund and pay for that stuff. So it's all working back and forth. We've got a case study here from Qantas. Qantas is one of the most popular case studies for business studies. I recommend Qantas, but I also did Macca's, and then I had references to IKEA and a couple other like businesses as well, but my main two were Qantas and Macca's, and I know that those two are very popular ones, especially Macca's lately. Qantas has always kind of been a base for business studies, but especially in recent years, Macca's has been on the rise. So let me know in the live chat. I feel like a YouTuber. Let me know in the live chat if you guys are doing either Qantas or Macca's, or if you guys are doing another one. I know IKEA is very popular too, but all different schools recommend different case studies. So for Qantas, the funding, the marketing strategy has been through new check-in facilities, new carriers flying into China, and a budget plan including Jetstar. And that's been evaluated by analyzing sales, market share, and profitability. To fund HR, they've been paying the staff monetary and non-monetary remuneration, training development. Can't speak English today. It's my second lecture, guys. Financial decisions affecting HR affects the staff levels in industry disputes, outsourcing, launching new airlines and cutting flights, and operations. They fund and finance is funding the fleet renewal, raising the budget and cost controls. So in between 2013 and 2014, they spent 1.9 billion on new planes. So that's just really showing the interdependence between the two, and how they're overlapping with each of the functions. Let's get into the financial objectives. Now, I am not going to shut up about the financial objectives today, because financial objectives come in so heavily in processes and so heavily in strategies. So it's really just connecting role strategies and processes all together. I feel like there's so much overlap between them, and as soon as I recognized this when I was doing business, finance got a lot easier. I seriously hated finance. There was nothing more I hated than math, and our business teacher told us that like finance, like you had to do like the ratios and the math, and I was like, no, clocking off, not for me. I'm not a math lover at all. So I really didn't like finance at the beginning, but I found it easier as soon as I started connecting some of the dots. And I think one of the biggest dots to connect is just realizing the importance of objectives and how understanding those at a base is going to help you across the other topics. So let's start with profitability, which is my favorite. We love profitability. Profitability is the best financial objective. Profitability comes up in all of business studies. I never want to hear, and this is a threat. This is a threat. I never want to hear that you guys aren't talking about business goals and maximizing profits in your business studies reports. Like, even in your case essays, every business at its core, the goal is to make a profit, is to maximize profits. Whether you're doing a finance report, whether you're doing a HR report, whether you're doing operations, profit always comes in. Profit always comes in and it's always a very big base goal. So profitability is very good to have a good understanding of, and it will help you across the other topics as well. It's the earning performance of the business and it indicates its capacity to use its resources to maximize profits. Profits satisfy shareholders in the short term, but in the long term, that sustainability is the most important consideration for any business. And to ensure profit maximization, management must monitor revenue, pricing policies, cost, expenses, and assets. What a coincidence that comes in processes and strategies. Then we've got liquidity, which is the extent to which a business can meet its financial obligations in the short term. Businesses must have sufficient cash flow to meet their financial obligations or to be able to convert current assets into cash. And then by controlling that flow of cash in and out of the business, financial managers ensure they have adequate funds when needed. And that's especially in terms of an emergency. The last thing you want is, all your workers leave, or a machine goes out, a car breaks down, and you don't have that money in the short term to quickly cover that. So the more liquid you are, the better. Efficiency is the ability of a business to minimize its cost and manage its assets so that maximum profit is achieved with the lowest possible level of assets. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but a lot of students, and I think a very popular misconception of business studies is that the more assets you have, the better. Like the more cash you have, the more inventory you have, like all the stock that you have, like yay, like the more accounts receivables. But that's not generally the case, because if they're not being managed well, you're at risk. So we're going to look at that a little bit later. But efficiency is really important because it's making sure you're achieving maximum profit with the lowest possible level of assets to balance that out. The main aim of efficiency is to monitor levels of inventory, cash, and the collection of receivables, so businesses are able to pay their debts when they fall due. So you want enough to cover your debts, but you don't want too much that it's just money floating around at risk to embezzlement, at risk to fraud and theft, and all that. We're going to look more into that though. Growth is the ability of a business to increase its size in the long term. Now, in terms of growth and its connection to the other topics, growth necessarily doesn't really come in processes or strategies. It's more connected with solvency, and that solvency is your ability to meet it in the long term, which then can help you increase its size in the long term. Those two are very connected. Growth depends on the ability of the business to develop and use its assets effectively to increase sales, profits, and market share. And growth is measured through the number of stores the business operates. And then last, we've got solvency, which is the extent to which a business can meet its financial obligations in the long term. Gearing is the proportion of debt and the proportion of equity that is used to finance the activities of a business. And we're going to look at the difference between debt and equity as well, because that comes up a lot in this topic as well. So the connection between the two is that businesses measure how solvent they are. So they measure how able they are to meet their obligations in the long term through the gearing. And gearing is just the percentage of assets that are funded by external sources, like debt. So we're going to go into all of that, but I hope that you can see that a lot of these ones are really just coming in the processes, and especially in the ratios. They're all being assessed, and you can determine each of them and the achievement of these objectives through the processes. So let's look at some case studies. We've got Qantas, our fave. So for liquidity, Qantas operates on a negative working capital position, meaning they hold very little reserves and use the cash received to pay long-term debts and reduce interest payments. Qantas has facilities in place for such a standby facility of $300 million to draw cash when needed to pay creditors. So they've got that facility where if they need the cash, they can draw 300 million of it. But they work on a negative working capital position so that they don't actually hold those assets very much at all. Like they're holding very little reserves, and the use of cash is paying off long-term debts and reducing interest payments. So they don't actually hold on to those assets as much. And you'd think, oh, Qantas is they're making crazy profits. They've got so much money, but they're still not holding on to their assets. And that's really at that point where the more assets you have, it's not necessarily a good thing. You're much better off managing them and balancing them and monitoring those assets. I'm so sorry. My nose is like so itchy. So you're going to see me like scratching it half of this lecture. Profitability at Qantas in the airline industry is relatively poor. So in 2014, due to higher fuel prices and weaknesses in the domestic airline industry, Qantas suffered a major loss of $646 million. In 2017, it turned around and reported a $1.4 billion profit. And it shows the the effectiveness of Qantas' recent financial strategies, specifically its cost-cutting measures via their transformation plan. And you can look in the case studies. You don't even necessarily have to use them from other people's notes. If you're bothered, you can always search up online examples as well. And there's so many online statistics that you can find. I think for profitability, it's good to show a difference of how maybe at one point they weren't too profitable, and then with time they were. COVID is so good to bring up in business. I'm sorry, my grade, we were affected by COVID, and you guys would have been as well. But I brought in COVID at any point in business reports, in case study essays. I was like, due to the influence of the COVID-19 like virus, like epidemic, like bring it up. And I think especially for case studies, you can show how, like, obviously during COVID the airline industry was relatively poor profitably because people weren't traveling and couldn't travel. And then you can show how since restrictions have been lifted, there's been a growth in how they've become more profitable and how they've worked with the government to become more profitable, all of that. But I think COVID, like, we're gonna use it. It happened to all of us. We're all victims of it, so we're gonna use it in our business studies reports, and our answers. Even in short answers, I feel like every single business was affected by COVID. Some businesses for the better, a lot of businesses for the worse with the closures, but others for the better. And when you look at like online businesses and how many businesses were forced to turn online after COVID, but now are completely online, there's so much you can talk about with COVID. So I definitely recommend that if you're struggling with case studies or just making those connections. I think COVID is, I was about to say I think COVID is great. No, but I think COVID is a great way that you can like maximize case study responses and bring things up. For efficiency, Qantas's efficiency has increased in recent years due to a decreasing total expense ratio. This has been driven by the introduction of new and efficient aircraft such as the Dreamliner and new IT systems. So again, this is role of finance, but we're bringing up the expense ratio, which is a process. So it's just showing the overlapping between the two. And that's why I think having a base of these is important. In 2014, for growth, Qantas cut costs and ordered for new planes, specifically in Asia. But because there's been bounce backs in profitability, they've been introducing new routes, such as its direct flight from Perth to London. So that's already showing the growth. And then for solvency in 2014, Qantas's gearing rapidly increased due to its falling profitability. However, their recent turnaround in profitability enabled them to reduce their net debt. As a result, Qantas has reduced its gearing, making the airline more financially stable, evident in their improved credit rating. So in terms of the case studies, these are just some examples, but having just a base understanding of what these objectives are really goes a long way in business studies, because what you'll find, and what I'm going to show you guys, especially when we come to processes and strategies, is that there are specific ratios for each of these objectives, and then specific strategies that you use for each of those ratios to achieve each of these objectives. So there's very much a connection between the three, and finding out that connection can really just help you identify, okay, which strategy should I use, which process should I use, what should I talk about, because it's not always specified in the exam, and that's where you can fall into mistakes. So let's look at this one, guys. It's answer in the chat. Solvency is the ability for a business to, is it A, maximize its profit, B, increase its market share, C, meet its long-term financial commitments, or D, meet its short-term financial commitments? So let's leave it in the chat to all those watching live. My advice for multiple choice is do as many as possible, because like I said, the exam's been around for over 10 years. So I can't do maths, guys, but there's so many past practice questions that you can try. And the more multiple choice you do, the more confident you'll feel with it. I really don't recommend taking multiple choice for granted. I think multiple choice is such a steal in business studies, only because like multiple choice is 20 marks and the answers are all there. You just have to make sure you pick the right one. I know that's like easier said than done, but in that compared to a 20-mark business report, like on the spot, you've got no clue what they're going to ask. You've got no clue what topic they're going to ask. I just think that making use of the 20 multiple choice is so important, because getting 20 out of 20 there is and getting like adding up those like 1 marks here and there and getting in that higher band easier and more achievable than the business report. Now, that doesn't mean it's not achievable in the business report, and there's obviously the right things you can do that, but the answers are there in multiple choice. And as soon as I got that mindset, I really started focusing on multiple choice, because I remember in my prelims, I just didn't care. I was like, oh, I don't really like it's fine. I just rushed through them. I was like, oh, I just need to get them done. Like, stupid multiple choice. Like, I need to get to my like report. I need to write my case essay. Like, I was very much in a rush, and I kind of ignored them. And I found that in my other subjects too. But it weighs just as much as that report that you're so scared to write, and it weighs just as much as that case essay that you're like memorizing and working so hard for. So I think treating it importantly and realizing like this can be like a weapon that you can use for your marks, and you can steal extra marks here and use them in areas that you're not as confident with. So love that. We love multiple choice. Hopefully we can do some more practices throughout, but hopefully you guys got C, because it's long-term financial commitments. If it was liquidity, it would be short-term, and if it was profitability, it would be maximize its profits. And then again, they always, a lot of the time, they'll just be like one that's like random, like you belong in marketing, get out of here. And let's look at this one. Why is liquidity an objective of financial management? I want to see which of you guys are confident enough to leave a point in the live chat. Also with the live chat, please, like, don't think that you have to leave like a full 4 out of 4 mark response, full line sentences. Like, even if it's just a couple words, I'm happy to be in the chat and just let you guys know if you guys are on the right path or not. But as long as you're talking about cash flow management, as long as you're talking about having sufficient cash that's coming in and out of the business, adequate funds, short-term obligations, as long as it's along those lines, you guys are getting those marks. So let's look at it. That was a 2-marker. So you'd want to start just with like what liquidity is. So liquidity is an objective of financial management because it shows the business how able it is to pay its current debts as they fall due. This allows the business to maintain a good credit rating and avoid late fees and additional interest payments. Yay! So you could have gone along those lines. That's 2 out of 2. But again, if you were talking about having adequate funds, having cash flow management in and out, you also would have gotten 2 out of 2. And this is the thing with business studies, that as long as you've got your base definition and like a good fact after it, you're going to get the marks. You're going to get the marks. Now let's finish with this learn to, which comes directly from the syllabus. Now, learn tos are ignored a lot of the time because we're so focused. There's so many learnabouts. Now, learnabouts are like all the points, like the role, the processes, influences, and strategies. Learn tos are on top of there, and there's a couple learn tos for each topic, but added up together, there's quite a few learn tos. And learn tos are like these full lines where it's like examine the potential conflicts between short-term and long-term financial objectives. In the beginning of business studies, I was really ignoring the learn twos. Like, my teacher kept saying, oh, the learn twos, oh, the learn twos, oh, the learn twos. But I was like, okay, look at how many dot points I have to study. Like, I'm not doing extra work. This is all more to do. But then with time, as I did more practice questions, I realized I had seen the questions before, and it's because a lot of them were coming from learn twos. So my advice for you guys is, as you're going throughout the year, I know it's an extra thing to do, and I don't expect everyone to do it because it took me time to actually be bothered to do it. But take the learn twos and just write, even if it's just in dot point form, just write some possible answers to them, because what you'll find is that in the short answer questions, they're taking the learn twos word for word. And a lot of the business reports and the case study essays are using the ideas from the learn two. The learn twos are the main goals that the syllabus and curriculum writers wanted you to gain, and the main learning outcomes they wanted you to have by the end of the topic. So it just makes sense that they use those and assess you on those to make sure that you've learned how to do that, and then they can use that to assess their own curriculum and their own syllabus and what needs to change. Can you tell she's becoming a business studies teacher? Can you tell she's studying teaching? But this is literally what we're looking at uni, like in my teaching degree, and a lot of it is the syllabus and the significance of these learn twos. So I really stress to you guys, I've got some insider knowledge. The learn twos are game changers in business studies. Even if you're not bothered writing full paragraph structured responses to them, if you just have a couple dot points like these ones here for each of them, and before exams you're going through them, I promise you that that's going to help out with your marks and really just consolidate and give you that confidence. A lot of the time the learn to questions are looking at those harder topics as well, and this is easily like a 6 or a 5 mark question that you could get in short answers. So Let's answer it together, guys. So this one's examine the potential conflicts between short-term and long-term financial objectives. For short-term tactical goals are 1 to 2 years, and operational goals are day-to-day goals. These goals are reviewed quite regularly to see if targets being met and resources are being efficiently used. So again, they're very they're set in like a short-term period, so naturally they're going to be reviewed regularly in that short-term length. While long terms are strategic goals, which are 5 years plus for a business, and they're really broad goals. In which each broad goal requires a series of short-term goals to assist in meeting that long-term goal. So there's an overall long-term goal, but to achieve that long-term goal, we need to achieve all these little things first. And that broad goal is pretty broad. And then, did I just say that broad goal is pretty broad? I would think so. I would think so. That long-term goal is pretty broad. And then their progress is reviewed annually to determine if changes are needed. So instead of reviewing it regularly, it's reviewed annually. So when you're looking at the conflicts between them, a big thing you'd say is that the short-term goals are on a 1 to 2 year or day-to-day basis, depending on whether they're tactical or operational. And because of that, they're reviewed regularly. They're also more specific because they're set in that shorter time period. So they do have that ability to have more detail and be more efficient. While in the long term, they're much broader, they're strategic goals, so they're 5 plus years. And because they have that longer term meeting, they're reviewed annually. That's the difference. That's done. There are your marks. That's your response. Um, and guys, this is how much love I have for all of you and for business. I wanted to give you guys an exemplar just so you can see if you guys aren't bothered, and I wanted to also give you this so you can see that there's no like one way to answer the learn twos. You can answer the learn twos and put it into dot points if that suits you, or if you're bothered, or if you honestly just prefer having a full response to it that you can read and study it, you can write one. So again, these slides are downloadable. If you're not looking to download the slides right now, or if you even just want a screenshot to add to your notes, I recommend it, only because this is a learn to answered for you, so you don't have to do it by yourself. But this is an example response, full marks exemplar. For example, with the long-term financial objective of growth and expansion, businesses must assess its asset structure to increase sales, market share, and profitability. Expanding the business will broaden customer reach and increase engagement, providing benefits in the form of increased sales and long-term profitability. Business growth opens up favorable financing opportunities, attracting investors who can assist in providing additional funds when needed. However, in funding the business's expansion, there is an additional liability that needs to be paid. If the funds required for business growth and expansion are sourced using external debt instruments, then interest also needs to be paid, thus lowering solvencies while increasing gearing. This decision to pursue long-term growth may cause conflict with short-term objectives such as profitability and liquidity. As a result, cynicism among shareholders and investors may arise as the increase in interest and additional financial expenses impacts on the business's profitability and their ability to maximize their return on their investment. So this one is very exemplar, clearly, and it's bringing in very specific goals. So this is more just like a general understanding of the conflicts, but this is linking them to the financial objectives, and the long-term financial objectives are solvency and are growth, while the short-term ones are liquidity. Profitability can go across both because you want to be profitable in the long term, but you also want to be profitable in the short term, and then efficiency. So just splitting up those objectives and just understanding how they can be long term and how they can be short term. But naturally, liquidity, which is meeting financial like being able to like pay like financial obligations in the short term, naturally that is a short-term objective. Just like solvency is being able to meet financial obligations in the long term, naturally that is a long-term objective. So just being able to go back to each of these and identify, okay, which one is a short term, which one's a long term, and how can they all clash with each other is very important. And that comes up in this learn to. It starts with this base goal and then it moves into how those long-term financial objectives and those short-term financial objectives are affecting different goals of the business. So if you guys wanted an example of how to answer that, there's one here. Let's move into influencers, guys. Okay, for influencers, we specifically chose to look at some of the harder ones. Honestly, I think most of the finance influencers are pretty hard. I think they're the hardest influencers out of all the topics. But can we actually talk about this in the chat? Is influencers just not underrated in isn't don't you think influencers is a bit underrated in terms of how hard it is across all the topics? Like I feel like even in marketing and HR, influencers is where it gets heavy, but like I feel like the marketing strategies are easier than the marketing influences. And same for HR. I think marketing strategies are easier than HR influences. Can someone affirm me? Or someone disagree with me? Let's talk about it. I want to talk about it in the chat. I want to start some discussion about that. My nose is still so itchy. I'm so sorry. I can never let myself rewatch this video because I'm literally just scratching my nose the whole video. I don't know what's going on. But we chose government because government is one of the harder ones, where a lot of students are losing marks. But on top of that, it's also one of the learn twos. So one of the learn twos is analyze the influences of government and the global market on financial management. So the big one you guys need to know for government and for finance is ASIC. So ASIC is the Australian Securities Investment Commission. Let me just tell you now, ASIC and ACCC always get confused, always. ACCC is always going to come up in marketing because it's got to do with fairness in trading and in the market, while ASIC is always got to do with finance. So a lot of the times in finance multiple choice questions, they'll give you ASIC, they'll give you the ACCC as an option, but it's not that. A lot of the times when they bring up different statutory commissions and different bodies, your answer is going to be ASIC. So it's an independent statutory commission who is accountable to the Commonwealth Parliament. They enforce and administer the Corporations Act of 2001 whilst protecting consumers and investors in areas such as investment, life insurance, banking, superannuation, and general insurance in Australia. I really swear you need to know this. So that what they are, so they're an independent statutory commission who's accountable to the Commonwealth Parliament, but also that they're enforcing and administering the Corporations Act of 2001. I cannot tell you how many short answers have asked about this point because, again, it's from a learn to, so they're really focusing on assessing that in trials and in HSC, but also just in the multiple choice, it will ask like what law is ASIC enforcing, and they'll have all these different laws. If you can just connect it to the Corporations Act and you know that, I really recommend that. And also knowing that their aim is to reduce fraud and unfair practices in financial markets is very important. Honestly, this whole slide, these 3 points I think are the most important. And if you have that as a base understanding and that's all you know about ASIC, I think it'll still take you far. I think it will still take you far. They collect information about the companies, such as the financial information that companies must disclose in their annual report. If any business is found to be in breach of these laws, ASIC will investigate the matter and determine an appropriate remedy, whether that's civil or criminal. And then failure to comply with ASIC's rules and guidelines will lead to a deterioration in the business's reputation and trust. So these are just some general points about ASIC. It's very big to do with protection from fraud and unfair practices. And then again, with like even with the deterioration, if they're not complying with ASIC's rules, ASIC goes and exposes them, and that's when you'll see businesses on the news that like the ASIC has like exposed. That deteriorates their reputation and trust. That deterioration of reputation and trust leads to reduced sales. Because if I saw a business that was like it's like involved in like a lot of fraud or like embezzling money, or like financially was really unfair in their practices, you're not going to want to support them. And a lot of it's kind of like cancel culture. It's like cancel that business. We don't support. So that's why ASIC's really important, in the work that they're doing is really important. Then there's company taxation. I'm so sorry. I promise these are like, honestly, all of like, I'm not even gonna lie, I really wasn't a fan of many of the influences of finance, just because you know what's also and sorry, I've just got the syllabus up next to me. The banks, unit trust, finance companies, superannuation funds, Australian Securities Exchange, investment banks, and life insurance, that buff sale, however you guys say it. No. I really hope that some of you guys have done finance and this isn't your introduction. This isn't for everyone an introduction to it. If you've done finance, you know what I'm talking about. The influences are just not pretty. The influences are not pretty. The influences were not making me love business studies too much. But this is company taxation. So all incorporated Australian businesses are required to pay company tax on their profits earned in the financial year. And company tax is a proportional tax. It's levied at 30% of the company's net profits and is paid before profits are distributed as dividends. Any increase in company tax drives up the price of goods and services, which then decreases the consumer demand because it's more expensive. And then that's decreasing their overall profitability. Okay, I'm just trying to see if there's anything else. I'm just looking at the syllabus. Is there anything else I wanted to say about company taxation? it's an essential source of funding for the government because it allows them to provide essential resources and services like healthcare. But businesses need to make sure that their financial records are up to date with that, um, and that um, they're not overstating their taxes either. The final influence that we're going to look at, and again, it's from the Learn To, so got to come up, got to come up. This Learn To is the influences of government and the global market on financial management. I really want to focus on global financial management in this lecture because I remember when I was in school, it was something we just briefly touched over. And even my students that I tutor for business studies now, no one really feels confident with global market strategies. And I hope that some of you do. I don't want that to be a generalization. But even when I was doing it, I was just kind of like, oh, I'll focus on the other strategies. Like, it's not even in Australia. Like, what's the chance it comes up? It'll come up. It comes up, especially when you're dealing with outsourcing. And much of the time it can be connected with operations and global outsourcing. We don't want to risk it. We don't want to risk it. So let's talk about it. It's actually not too bad. I think the influences, I think when you get to the strategies that it gets a little bit harder. So global economic outlook refers specifically to the projected changes to the levels of economic growth throughout the world. So if it's a positive outlook, the gross world product is projected to increase, which impacts the financial decisions of a business. And as a result of a positive outlook, there's an increasing demand for goods and services, which requires businesses to increase their production. But by increasing that production, the financial managers need to purchase additional equipment and employ extra staff, which means that costs may rise. On the other hand, poor economic conditions may adversely impact financial managers as a global economic downturn reduces consumption, investment, and consumer confidence, which then hinders their profitability and solvency. So, let me explain it in a simple light. Positive outlook, I like to think of it like rainbow and sunshine for businesses and for everyone. Everyone's happy. Basically, the economy is looking good. Everyone's happy. A lot of people are working. There's high employment rates because they're working and people have more disposable income. They're going out and they're spending money. Everyone's like, let me buy whatever I want. Everyone's making money. Everyone's happy. Everyone's working because they're spending money. Businesses are making money. And because there's high demand from how many people are spending, businesses are required to make more and produce more, which is just increasing demand. Of course, they've got to meet that with supply. So there's an increased cost for businesses, but that's rewarded with increased profitability. And all of that is helping. And then there's more jobs and they have to create more jobs and pay for more services, which is just creating more payment. And then altogether, the economy is just booming. It's basically just an economic boom. Everyone's happy, super positive outlook, rainbow sunshines. We love money. The negative economic outlook and a poor economic outlook is the complete opposite. Low unemployment rate, because people aren't working, they're hesitant to spend their income. Because people aren't spending their income, goods and services aren't selling, which is reducing jobs even further because there isn't demand. Then it's limiting the need for supply, which is also reducing costs. It's reducing costs, it's reducing the need for labor, which is then in turn reducing the employment rate. And then businesses and also banks don't really feel confident giving out loans because they know that we're in like a negative economic outlook and the economy is kind of in a downturn. While in the positive outlook, banks are like, you know what, have this money, like we trust you, like everyone's spending, take it. It's basically just the way I memorize it, and the way that helps me is just understanding positive outlook. Everybody's literally happy, economy's happy, businesses are happy, consumers are happy, workers are happy, government's happy. Complete opposite. It's like two ends of the spectrum, and it's like super happy and then depressive state of the economy because it's global economic downturn. Okay, that's global economic outlook. For me, I had to memorize it that way, and for some of the topics, if I didn't, I don't want to say dumb it down and like discredit myself, but if I didn't make it as simple as possible for myself, there was no way I was going to understand it. And I have no shame in saying that. I don't want you guys to think, and I really wish that I wasn't as hard on myself as I was when I was in year 12, but sometimes I'd be dumbing stuff down and I'd be like, man, I'm so dumb that I like had to do this, like as if like students that are doing well did it. And like I still got the marks, and that's not me being like, yeah, guys, like I got a band 6 in business, but I didn't even study, or like I studied in this like super dumb way. It's not even to flex. It's more just to validate any of you guys that are going through it. Do what works for you. There's no shame. Like I'm not embarrassed admitting that now, but at the time when I was doing it, I was like, this is so embarrassing that I have to imagine positive economic outlook as a rainbow. I was like, what is wrong with you? Like, that is so embarrassing. I would not admit that to anyone. But now that I got my 95 in business, and I remember writing about that in my trials, I was like, you know what? That was smart. That was smart, and that helped me, so it's validated. So yeah, that's my rant. I'm very big. Clearly, I hope you guys can see I'm very big on this whole picture of what you're supposed to look like compared to what you're actually doing. Do what works for you. It worked for me. It got me the marks I needed. So don't feel embarrassed if you have to dumb things down in business. There's no shame in that. There's so much content. A lot of it's really hard, especially all this finance stuff. For me, I was not a math student. It didn't matter if I was doing really well in English and all that. None of that mattered. I was not a math student. A lot of this was not clicking, and in operations as well. My brain just wasn't. I don't really think it was wired in that way. I was very much like an English history student in year 12. So these topics just weren't, business wasn't businessing. Like, it just was not connecting. I couldn't connect the dots. So unless I found ways that were working for me, and you'll see it later when I get to some other topics, there was no way I was going to get through them. So yeah, I recommend simplifying it as much as possible for yourself and feel no shame in it. YOLO, live, laugh, love. Let's keep moving. For availability of funds, it's the ease which a business can access funds for borrowing on the international market. And that comprises of various institutions who lend money to individuals or companies seeking to raise capital. But there's obviously various conditions and rates that occur, and they're primarily based on risk, demand, and supply in the domestic economic conditions. So, for example, the economic downturn of the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2009, scratch your nose one more time, I'm so sorry, had a critical impact on the availability of funds for companies, which led to a sharp rise in interest rates because there was such a high level of risk in lending. And then that availability of funds also affects businesses' financial management because it affects whether or not they're going to obtain adequate funds to then successfully expand, which is then affecting their growth, which, not to say I told you so, but everything in financial objectives links to one another. The final one is interest rates, and this comes up again in global market strategies. Interest rates are the cost of borrowing money, but the higher level of risk involved in lending to a business, the higher the interest rates. So with Australian interest rates generally being higher than developing companies, Australian businesses a lot of the time are tempted to be like, you know what? Why would I pay interest rates here when they're higher than developing countries across the world, when I could just go there and take advantage of the cheaper and lower interest rates? But they don't realize a lot of the time that they're proposing themselves to risk because as a business, they're susceptible to exchange rate movements. Just because it's cheaper now doesn't mean it's going to be cheaper in 5 months' time or in 6 months' time when that whole contract is sorted and confirmed. So a lot of the time businesses are like, you know what, we're just going to go to this country, we're going to go to this developing country, we're going to take advantage of how cheap their exchange rate is, how cheap their interest rate is, and like get our bonus. But it doesn't always work like that, and it is risky. So here is a case study. So for finance, for economic outlook before 2009, they were benefiting from the impacts of globalization because obviously that was increasing their demand for services, and it was reflective of their all-time high net profit of $970 million. But then after that, everything comes to a crash. So they went from this positive global economic outlook to a negative, where they experienced a rapid decrease in their international revenue by 88%. And as a result, people stopped traveling and corporate travel was cut. So that just shows how, like, that's what I mean. Like, it's two sides, and it's like rainbow, sunshine, happiness, $970 million profit, and then 88% decrease in revenue before and after. That's why it worked for me. Availability of funds. So since the global financial crisis, the supply of funds has been lower in Australia and overseas Qantas due to the closure of many financial institutions. And a lot of global financial institutions were also implementing stricter lending criteria. So Qantas was assessed to be riskier because they had reduced profits in 2014. And again, when lenders are looking at, do we trust this business, they're looking at the profits they're making. And if their profits haven't been too high, they're not essentially going to trust to lend you as much as you might want. And for interest rates, Qantas is exposed to movements in interest rates in Australia and overseas. As interest rates increase, so do the interest repayments Qantas pays. Qantas has shifted most of its operations overseas and is more cost effective to fund them from an overseas bank due to lower interest rate. Lower interest rates. But in saying that, if those exchange rates do increase, so the interest rates, they're lost. Okay, let's do it. Which organization ensures that Barb's Batteries Pty Ltd operates in a financially responsible manner? Which one, guys? Which one? There's only one right answer. There's only one right answer. I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds. You guys can leave that in the chat and I'll let you know if that's right. Okay. Yay. Process. Yay. Okay. Oh, my nose. My nose. This is really embarrassing. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. Okay, let's look at financial needs and planning and implementing. I always ignored this when I was doing year 12. When I was doing year 12, when I was in business, when I was studying business in year 12. I don't know if you guys are the same, but when I was doing business, like when I thought of processes, I was like ratios. I was like, I need to do the ratios. I literally forgot that any other point existed. I was like, it's just the ratios. No, it's not. No, it's not. And then I'd get questions on this and I'd be like, I don't actually know anything. So I still sometimes forget that this comes up in processes because I feel like there's such a focus on the ratios, but this is how they can trick you. So the financial needs of a business are determined by the size of the business, the phase that it's in, the future plans for growth and development, and the capacity to source finance. So depending on that business plan, financial management has to set out the finance required, how they're going to source that, and then display their range of financial statements. But that financial statements also need to show that the business can generate a return on the investment. That's why they then use budgets, which provide information in quantitative terms about requirements to achieve a particular purpose. Budgets can show the cash required for planned expenditure, the cost of capital expenditure, the estimated use and cost of raw materials or inventory, and the number and cost of labor hours required for production. The budgets are just kind of showing all that planned expenditure, and then they can then use that for planning and implementing cuts and then applying strategies from there. Budgets also provide financial information on a business's specific goals and are used in operational, tactical, and strategic planning. Like we said, operational is day-to-day goals, tactical is 1 to 2 year goals, and strategic planning is 5+ year planning. They enable a constant monitoring of objectives and provide a basis for administrative control, control of expenses, and production planning. They also allow for the comparison of planned performance against actual performance to determine whether corrective action needs to be taken. So, then we get into record systems, which are the mechanisms employed by a business to ensure that data is recorded and the information provided is accurate, reliable, efficient, and accessible. A critical process in maintaining record systems is to minimize the amount of errors in the recording process to ensure financial managers produce accurate and reliable financial statements. I feel like record systems, the most important thing is kind of this point where it's like, let's minimize the amount of errors so that our reports are as accurate and reliable as possible. And to do that, they can use the double entry system of accounting, which acts as an important control mechanism, and it balances the entries and finds errors between them, just so you're not admitting systems that and accounting statements that have errors in them. But in that, financial risk comes. So financial risks are the risk to the business being unable to cover its financial obligations. So if the businesses aren't able to meet their financial obligations, they face the possibility of becoming bankrupt or insolvent. And then that's an added risk for businesses if they finance the operation from external debt instruments, because then they're getting chased up on all that money externally. So to minimize financial risks, businesses must consider the amount of profit that needs to be generated and then make sure that they're covering the cost of that debt as well as making a profit. It's great to make a profit, but if that profit and all it's doing is covering you the cost of your debt, you're literally at zero. It's like covering that debt and then still making profit on top of that. Then comes financial controls, which are the policies and procedures that ensure that the plans of a business will be achieved in the most efficient way. The most common causes of financial problems are theft and fraud, damage or loss of assets, and errors in the recording system. But that's why it's so important to have monitoring and financial controls in place so that you can monitor your assets like accounts receivables, inventory, and cash. The policies to do that and to promote control are clear authorization and responsibility for tasks in the business, separation of duties, rotation of duties, and control of cash. So important. Control of cash can literally be done with a cash register, but separation of duties and rotation of duties along with clear responsibility for tasks is really, really important. If you've got one person in a business who deals with all the accounts receivables, signs them all off, counts all the cash at the end of the day, banks all that cash, is doing all the record systems. If you've got one person doing all of those duties, you're more at risk to issues like theft and fraud because it's a lot of trust in one person. While if you're doing a separation of duties and a rotation of duties, and each of those duties have clear authorization and responsibility, you're more secure and stable because more people are going through it, which means naturally there's more checking and naturally you can pinpoint where it is that any of these common financial problems may begin. Now, Debt financing relates to short and long-term borrowing from external sources. The disadvantages of that, and this comes in, debt financing is also in influences, so that's why I wanted to talk about this point. The advantages of debt financing are that funds are readily available and can be acquired at short notice. The interest repayments are tax deductible as well, and it doesn't dilute the current ownership of the business. So if I go to a bank and I'm like, hey, I need a loan, I'm not losing control of my business. But if I was to turn to equity financing and I opened up shares for my business, I dilute the control that I own. So that's one of the disadvantages of equity financing. While the disadvantages of debt financing is its increased risk if debt comes from a variety of financial institutions due to interest charges. If I've got all these different financial institutions giving me money, I'm going to have all these different interest charges, and that comes at a risk because if I can't repay that interest, or if interest rates are going up, I'm a little bit stuck. Regular repayments also need to be made, and security may be required by the business. Equity financing is the internal source of finance in a business. It's cheaper than other sources because there's no interest repayments. Owners who have contributed to the business retain control over their finances. And then it doesn't have to be repaid unless the owner leaves the business. So overall equity is a cheaper option. And as long as it's the owner who's putting in their retaining profits, they can still retain that control. But in saying that, if it's not retained profits, because like we know, equity financing can come from new rights and shares, or it can come from retained profits and the owners putting in profits that they've already made from other times back into the business, or their own funds into the business. If it's not coming from that and it's coming from shares, ownership is diluted and current owners have less control. That's a disadvantage. Lower profits and returns for owners as well. And it's a long and expensive process to get the funds from those shares and from those investments. So it's really just a matter of considering which is going to work best for the business. Understanding the advantages and disadvantages is really important because it's a common short answer question. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of debt and equity financing? But also in the business report, I've seen quite a few times that they've written like, consider debt or equity financing for this business, and you have to recommend which is going to work better for them. If they're a business that is very focused on having control, and they just need money really quickly, short notice, just to quickly repay it, go to debt financing if there's kind of like a short-term emergency. But if it's more in the long term, they're much more focused on growth, and they'd like to get into the share market, into the ASX, or they'd like to like grow their business even further and just kind of take it public, then you'd recommend equity. It really just depends on the business. This is a case study for Qantas and how they use debt and equity financing. And the last one we're going to go to before we get to the ratios is matching the terms and source of finance to business purpose. Again, this is another dot point that a lot of my students just forget about, and I don't even blame them because I'm like, oh, this is a dot point. But this, again, very much links to influences, and that's why I think that the finance syllabus is very interlinked. So what it's saying is if businesses use short-term finance to fund long-term assets, then it causes financial problems for the business. So when you look at the syllabus, there's short-term debt, and that's where it's looking at overdraft and debentures. And then there's long-term debt where it's got mortgages and then the other forms of long-term debt. You want to make sure that when you've got a short-term asset, you're paying that off with short-term assets are paid off with short-term debt or short-term finance. Long-term assets are paid off with long-term debt. So why would you pay it, like for a house, for example, in mortgages, or for like a warehouse, you wouldn't use an overdraft for that because that's a short-term finance for a long-term asset. Same with buying like a massive machine. Why would you just overdraft your account on that? Like what is that going to achieve you in comparison to getting a long-term form of finance on that. Sorry, I thought I did that. I mean debenture for long term. So for short term, I've just got the syllabus up. For short term, overdraft, commercial bill, and factoring. And then for long term, it's mortgage, debenture, unsecured notes, and leasing. So you want to make sure that you're using the right source of finance for the appropriate asset. If it's a short-term asset, so if you just quickly need the money for inventory, for stock, or for those short-term assets, you're going to be using those short-term debt. While if it's a long-term asset and that's machinery, warehousing, and those longer terms that you're going to be paying off over longer time, you want to make sure you've got long-term finance. So the use of long-term finance to fund short-term assets means that the business is still paying the debt long after the financial situation has been resolved. So for example, if I got like a debenture, let's say I needed some quick stock and like one of the tops that I was selling at my clothing store sold out, and I quickly need like a 10K or like this quick restock of it. Why would I choose a debenture for that, which is going to be paid off over time, when I can just quickly overdraft my account or get a commercial bill on that? And then by the time that stock runs out, I've already paid off that debt because they're both short term, rather than still paying off this massive debenture after that whole situation, after all that stock's been sold. Like, that doesn't really match up. So you just have to make sure that financial managers match the term of the loan with the economic lifetime of the asset. If it's a non-current asset, it's a long-term financing, long-term borrowing, long-term debt. If it's a current asset, you want short-term borrowing. So it's just matching up those two. I'm sorry that I got debenture confused. There's so many different ones you can use. Let's get on to ratios. We've got some time left to finish up with ratios and strategies. A lot of the processes, I just want you guys to know, I'm going to link processes to strategies only because there's certain strategies that you use for certain ratios, so they very much interlink. So liquidity is the extent to which a business can meet its financial obligations. So for that, we're using the current ratio, which is assets divided by current liabilities. The acceptable ratio is 2-1. I recommend knowing the objective for each ratio, because each ratio is to achieve a certain objective, and that's how you can link the dot points. Know the objective, know the acceptable ratio as well, and then know which strategy to apply. Otherwise, they're going to give you the formula. It's really only profitability that you guys have to memorize some extra stuff. The current ratio measures a business's ability to pay back their current liabilities with current assets. So the higher the current ratio is, the more capable the business is in meeting short-term financial obligations. But if the ratio is too high, then the business can be criticized for using assets inefficiently. If you've got heaps of cash just lying around, you're at risk to theft and fraud. If you've got all this inventory just sitting there, not only are you paying all this warehousing fees, but all that inventory is dead weight money, because it's money sitting there that could be translated into cash, but it's not, because it's sitting there and instead it's becoming a cost. So having too many assets isn't always a good thing, and you're actually using them inefficiently if the ratio is too high. While if the ratio is too low, the business is at risk of not meeting their financial obligations, which then puts them at risk at bankruptcy and becoming insolvent and not being able to meet their debt. So we're not live, laugh, loving either of those. The gearing ratio determines the business solvency. So solvency, like we said, it's how they can meet their long-term financial obligations. And creditors specifically look at the gearing ratio to decide if they should invest or not. And that just shows them whether or not they're going to receive a good return on their investment. So that's where you do the total liabilities divided by total equity to find the gearing ratio, and that really shows and reflects the objective of solvency. For small businesses, the acceptable ratio is 0.5-1, while for large businesses, it's 1-1. And if the business is more highly geared, it carries a higher risk, but then there's a possibility to generate higher profits because of that risk. So it all depends. If the ratio is greater than 1, it indicates the business has more debt than equity. And if the ratio is between 0 and 1, it indicates the business has more equity than debt. So the higher the ratio, the less solvent the business is, because obviously it has more debt than it does equity, and the higher the risk of not meeting the financial obligation. So that's why the acceptable for large is 1-1 and the small is 0.5-1, because it's making sure there's not too much debt and they're not over relying on that external finance. For profitability, there's 3 different ratios that you can use. That's just profitability is how they're maximizing the profits. And it depends on the revenue earned and their ability to increase their selling prices so that they can cover their costs and expenses. We've got the gross profit ratio, the net profit ratio, and the return on equity ratio. Now, I've already seen that a lot of the time everyone's like, oh, but they give you all the ratios. They do. They'll say, find out the gross profit ratio, bracket gross profit divided by total sales, but they won't tell you how to figure out gross profit. They won't tell you how to figure out net profit. And for gross profit, you need COGS. So you guys need the COGS formula, the gross profit formula, and the net profit formula. You can just quickly Google that, or you can go back to your year 11 notes, because you guys would have done that in year 11. But please make sure you're putting that in your notes, because I don't want you to get caught up on these two and just believe like, oh, they're going to give it to me. They won't tell you how to figure that out. And not all financial sheets are going to tell you what the gross profit and net profit is. A lot of the time, that's the extra step that they expect you to have taken because you already know. So for the acceptable ratio for gross profit, it's 50%. For net profit, it's 13 to 20%. But of course, they prefer to have a higher net profit ratio. And for return on equity, they just prefer to have a high return. The gross profit ratio represents the amount of sales that are available to meet expenses resulting in net profit, and then that is used for the net profit ratio. And then the return on equity shows how effective the funds contributed by the businesses are. So it's showing them the return that they're getting on the money that they've put in from their investment. Efficiency is the ability of a business to minimize its costs and manage its assets so that maximum profit is achieved with the lowest possible level of assets. And the more efficient the business is, the greater the profits and financial stable it is. This is where you use the expense ratio, which again, they'll give you, and the accounts receivables ratio. Let me just tell you again, this is one of those secrets where a lot of, even like in my class, everyone was like, oh, I remember like I was studying and I was memorizing some like the net profit, and I memorized this formula as well. And some people in my class were like, oh, why are you doing that? They're going to just give it on the day. They'll give you sales divided by accounts receivables, but they won't tell you and they won't remind you that about the 365, where you have to divide it by 365 to find out how many times a year it's being collected. So that answer that you get here isn't right. It's actually how many days that the accounts receivables collected. So you guys need that one. Those are, I think, the main two ways that they can trick you with ratios. And it's really just tricking you because a lot of people think they're going to tell me I don't need to study this, but then they leave out this information. So you do need to know that extra step that after you do sales divided by accounts receivables, you have to divide that by 365 to find out how many days it takes to collect the accounts receivables. And for gross profit ratio, net profit ratio, you need to know how to find out gross profit, which you need the COGS ratio, the COGS formula, the GP formula, and the net profit formula. You guys need those three. Financial managers use the expense ratio to determine where the highest expenses are from and why the ratio has increased or decreased. A decline in the expense ratio indicates there's lower interest rates in the economy or that the business is using less debt, which we don't necessarily want to focus on. Then the account receivable turnover ratio measures the effectiveness of a business's credit policy and how efficiently it's collecting its debt. So a high turnover ratio indicates that the business has an efficient debt collection system. An ideal ratio is 12 times per year or every 30 days or less. If it's more than 30 days, it's not showing that they're very efficient in their turnover collection, which isn't good because their turnover, that's money that they've made that they're just waiting to collect. So if you're waiting 60 days to get your money, first of all, it's not good for your cash flow, but it's also just not good for your asset management either, because that's money that you should have and that should be owed, that you should have in your account that's not there because you're waiting. So having 30 days or less means that you're ideally being paid 12 times a year, and that really helps you throughout every single month of your cash flow, because you've got that money coming in to help out. Now, the last point I want to look at for this is the comparative ratio analysis. I, again, used to forget about this, but it's actually a learn too. So assess business performance using comparative ratio analysis. It doesn't sound as hard as, like, it's very wordy, but all this is, and if you guys have already done finance, you'll know that a lot of the time in finance, you find out your ratio and the ratio that they give you, but then you'll compare that to industry average, you'll compare it to the acceptable ratio, you'll compare it to your competitors' average or competitors' last year's numbers. Comparative ratio analysis is where you confirm against other figures, similar businesses, and industry standards. And by doing that, they can identify trends in financial data, they can take corrective action, and then they can make improvements where needed. You might look at your business from a very like through one lens and think, oh, you know what, our ratios are great, our profitability is great. But then as soon as you compare it to another business, and as soon as you see how other businesses in the industry are performing, you're like, you know what, we actually have to do so much better. Why are they doing so much better than us? What are they doing that we're not? Where can we improve? How can we correct this? And through that they can achieve their financial objectives more. So this dot point isn't necessarily anything you have to study. It's more just making sure that you know the acceptable ratios for each of them, and then just being able to identify that by comparing them and by setting those benchmarks, and through that comparative analysis they can notice those trends and then make improvements naturally. Now, I considered this sacred and I wanted to put these in so you guys have them. I studied off of these when I was in year 12 as well. But at 8 notes for all our business students, we really recommend it too. They're basically just summary tables of everything you need to know about the ratios. They've got the objective, so which ratio is connected to which. So like we saw, current ratio was connected to liquidity. So they've got all the objectives in there. They've got the source that it comes from, so whether it's from the balance sheet, the cash flow, or the income statement. They've got the explanation, they've got the acceptable, but most importantly, it's got the strategy. Now, hear me out. For current ratio, for example, and current ratio is how much a business is able to pay in the pay debt in the short term and meet short term financial obligations. So how liquid they are. Let's say from the strategies I picked profitability, those profitability strategies aren't necessarily going to help me because I'm dealing with current assets and current liability, but cash flow strategies and working capital strategies, which is specifically dealing with current assets and current liabilities, which are the two in question, but also cash flow, which is helping me manage that cash to pay off those current liabilities and balance those assets, are going to help me. So this is what I mean where in business studies, and it's with the other topics as well and with the other functions, I know there's heaps of different strategies and a lot of people are like, you know what, I'm going to learn all of them and I can use any strategy for any question. It's not always the case, and especially in finance, there are strategies that are better suited to certain ratios. So that's why I wanted to give you guys this sheet so you guys can see, and I've got them for all the different ones. So even if you don't want to download the slides, I recommend just having a copy of this. This is all I studied for ratios and it really helped me with my marks, but also just with my assessments and my understanding. So I could just connect which was working with which. For current ratio, for example, if you do discounts on early payments, distribution of payment, and factoring, they're all coming from cash flow management. And then we've got control of current assets and control of current liabilities, which are working capital management. So they're specifically going to help with those. For profitability, the two main strategies I recommend, guys, is expense minimization or revenue controls. Revenue controls is literally just increasing your sales through marketing and maximizing your revenue with a better mix of marketing. So with profitability, the only two ways you can really affect it is increasing your sales or decreasing your costs and expenses. To decrease your costs and expenses, you want to turn to expense minimization, which is one of the profitability management strategies. For expense minimization, there's all different things you can do. You can start buying in bulk, bundle pricing, you can outsource, you can do a casualization of the workforce because casuals don't have to be paid annual leave and sick leave, so they're actually cheaper as a whole in terms of labor. You can find cheaper suppliers, you can downsize or relocate operations. There's all different things that you can do to minimize your expenses, and by minimizing your expenses, you're going to end up maximizing your profits. But on top of that, if you are struggling to cut down on your expenses, you can actually just increase your sales and look at your marketing mix and use your marketing more efficiently. So looking at the pricing policy, making sure you're not overpricing, making sure you're reaching your target market, adequate sale forecast, and just again, you can really, if you don't feel too confident on finance and you get a question on profitability strategies, best believe you bring in all your marketing knowledge. And I was a marketing lover. You can bring all of that in and literally just talk about marketing strategies because it's the 4 Ps, which are the 4 Ps from the marketing strategy syllabus. So you can just pull that in. That's a little hack of business studies. Same for efficiency and the expense ratio. You want to make sure that, well, it's expenses, so utilize expense minimization as a strategy, and that's why certain strategies are going to fit ones better. But for accounts receivables, it doesn't really make too much sense to do expense ratio, but it does make sense to do discounts for early payment or to turn to factoring, which are directly associated with accounts receivables, and discounts for early payments of your accounts receivables, or selling your accounts receivables to a factoring company and getting 70 to 90% of that money back. Use the right strategies for the right objective. And then solvency, which is total liabilities versus owner's equity. You can lower your debt through expense minimization. You can do working capital management strategies. You can leasing, factoring. There's different strategies that you can use for each, but that's why I really recommend just having a copy of these, because I think that being able to connect your processes with your strategies is a really big game changer, and you'll find that comes up a lot in the exam. let's quickly look at some strategies. So there's cash flow, which is the movement of cash in and out of a business over a period of time. If more money goes out than comes in, or if more money must be paid out before cash payments have been received, there's cash flow problems. So you really want to make sure that it's balanced. It means that you're keeping cash readily available in the business by using cash flow statements, speeding up payments by debtors, and delaying payments of suppliers. So you can have inflows, and your inflows are coming from your sales, from your accounts receivables, from commissions, dividends, rent, and interest. Outflows is all the money coming out, which is payments to suppliers, interest on loans, operating expenses, drawings, purchase of assets, and loan repayments. So the first strategy is cash flow statements, which I think is pretty good to talk about as a strategy because you guys would have done that in year 11. So for the cash flow statement, it's a financial statement that indicates the movement of cash receipts and cash payments resulting from financial transactions over a period of time. It's a continuous rolling cash budget. It shows patterns of short-term management of cash inflow and outflow. It can help you identify trends and act as a predictor of change, but it also indicates the movement of cash receipts and payments resulting from transactions over a period of time. So you can see like, oh, in June, we actually have a lot of outflow. Maybe we should distribute our payments throughout the month, or we should turn into throughout the year, or start paying this fee quarterly so we don't have this massive outflow all in one month. And a lot of the times companies, because June is end of financial year, a lot of their bills will be due then, and they'll have a massive outflows, while they can then apply that strategy of distribution of payment to help that. This is a question from the 2016 HSC. So it's got the table shows cash flow information for a business. What is the opening balance for April? This is direct calculator question where you're just going to pump in those numbers. And when you pump them in, this one's a bit frustrating because you have to go through all of them to get to April, which is at the end. But when you pump them in, you'd get to a negative 24,000. I just wanted to put this in so if you guys come back to these slides later on, you can figure it out. But if you do have your calculator or your phone nearby, you can definitely have a go at finding out that cash flow. This is purely just numbers and doing the difference from the opening, adding on that in, and then minusing the out to see what you're left with, and then starting all over again. Now, management strategy 1 is distribution of payments, which is distributing payments throughout the month, year, or other periods so that cash shortfalls don't occur. You don't want all your large expenses due at the same time. So yearly distributions mean that there's equal cash flow each month rather than large outflows in certain months. And this allows the business to have cash flow projection to identify periods of shortfalls and surpluses, and then better adequately just distribute and organize their money. Number 2 is discounts for early payments. I really recommend feeling confident with this only because it comes up across quite a few of the ratios, especially the accounts receivable turnover ratio. So it's most effective when it's targeted at creditors who owe large amounts in a financial year. It basically means that as the creditor, you will pay me now instead of when the money is due for 2 months. So maybe I own a kitchen business and I build your kitchen and I'm like, okay, pay me back in 2 months. But 1 month later, 1 month in, I'm like, you know what? I want to hire a new worker. I want to buy a new car. Instead of going to debt, I already have this money that you owe me, but I don't want to wait another month. I need this car now. I'm going to go to you and I'll be like, hey, I know the money's due next month, but if you pay me now, I'll give you 5% off. I'll give you 10% off. You get to decide what that discount is. And then you're like, okay, I'll pay you it. I'm getting it cheaper. I'm getting my money. For me, it's great because I can get the money straight away, but at the same time, it's coming at a loss because I've got the discount. It's good though because that discount is something that I decided. The opposite is factoring. Now, factoring gets confusing because a lot of people confuse it with the discount for early payment. It's very similar, but factoring is when a third party is involved. So factoring is when there's a third party business. I go to them and I'm like, hey, I really need this money. Can you chase up this person to get it and give me the money now? The factoring business would be like, okay, let's say I had like 100 grand. I had an accounts receivable of 100 grand. I'm going to go to that company. I'm going to be like, listen, I have this accounts receivable of 100 grand. They're going to be like, okay, depending on the business, it'll either be 70 to 90% that they'll give me. So they can either give me 70K or they can give me 90K. They can keep, let's say, for example, it's 90%, like their business policy is 90%. They're like, okay, we'll give you back 90%. So where I get 90K on the spot, they get to keep 10K for what they do. And then they go and chase up that person and wait for that person to fulfill that account. So then I get my money straight away. But again, it's coming at the loss where that company gets a minimum of 10%, the factoring company. But it means that I get my money sooner, and even though it's a bit less, it helps improve my working capital management in the event of like an absolute emergency. But again, discount for early payment means yes, you have to chase it up, and yes, that's timely, but you can decide that discount. While for factoring, it can be 10 to 30% loss that factoring business gets to keep. So you really got to consider, am I willing to lose that money? How desperate am I for money? For profitability, please, expense minimization always, it's just such a go-to, and I feel like it's one of the easiest ones to use. So it's just reducing expenses wherever possible. Expense budgets are really helpful because they'll show you where expense patterns are invisible, where are visible, and then you can eliminate waste and reduce that unnecessary spending so that you're increasing your productivity and efficiency and then still achieving profit maximization. That can be through casualization of the workforce, outsourcing, bundle pricing, downsizing or relocating operations, and finding cheaper suppliers. Now we're going to finish off with global strategies. Sorry, I'm like running through, but I want to make sure that we get all of this done. Again, all of this is going to be in the downloadable slides. Like, you can download all these slides to come back to this. This is recorded as well to come back to. I'm 100% going to make TikToks on this, so if you guys are on TikTok, follow up. But otherwise, any questions about any of this, I hope you guys are asking. I really hope I'm not just sitting in the live chat like waiting for questions. I hope we're having a chat. My goal, like, I'm recording this in advance and this is going to be premiered, but my goal is that we're having some fun on the chat. We're all becoming besties and we're getting through all this content. Exchange rates are the value of one country's currency in terms of another currency, but again, exchange rates are always fluctuating. Now, if you're an economics student, this is one of the parts where economics and business really overlap. Personally, I was not an economics gal, and the exchange rates and when we deal with other money and the converting wasn't my strong point. But this is how I really understood it. So appreciation is where the upward movement of the Australian dollar goes against another currency, which means it's raising the value of AUD. So one Australian dollar is buying more foreign currency, but one foreign currency is buying less Australian dollars. Now that's great for us when we're buying from overseas and we're importing, but exporting, who's going to want to buy from us when one of their units buys less of our AUD? Like, no one's going to want to buy. So it's great for us and when we're importing, but no one's going to want to buy overseas. Depreciation is the opposite, where the Australian dollar is moving downwards against another currency. So it's lowering the value of AUD. So one foreign currency buys more AUD. So that means that our exports are going up because everyone wants to buy from Australia. They're like, listen, like, look how cheap it is. But for us, we're too scared to buy from overseas because everything's really expensive. So one AUD is purchasing less foreign currency. I always think of, if you guys have gone to like StockX, or you've gone to like buy shoes, or even just online, you know how sometimes naturally when you're doing online shopping, the price doesn't convert, especially from like USD. So like you'll see shoes and you'll be like, oh, $200, that's mad. And like you convert it and it's like $300, $400. And you're like, what's going on here? Or even if you've gone overseas, I remember when I went to London, the pound at that time was nearly double. So I saw like this pencil case. I was like, oh, $20, that's mad. And then the pencil case was 40. And I had a student who was telling me like pieces nearly cost like $50 in like USD, like when she was in America at one time. So it's all depending on the dollar. But I think if you've traveled overseas or if you've just done online shopping, it's a really good way for you to just understand how the currency is changing and how that's going to affect you. That's also then affecting the interest rates, because a lot of, like I said before, a lot of businesses are like, oh, cheap interest rates, I'm just going to go to a developing country and borrow from them. But just because the interest rate is lower at that time, if the exchange rate changes, then that interest rate is going to go up as well. So you cannot trust. It is a risk. Methods of international payment is how you can get around that. And these are them in terms of risk for the exporter. So payment in advance, letter of credit, bill of exchange, and clean payment. Let's go through them. Payment in advance, like I said before, like I said with the rainbow and how I had to like dumb down, what was I dumbing down? Global economic outlook. I also had to dumb down payment in advance. The only way that I understand this and that makes sense to me is that payment in advance is like when you go online shopping. When you go online shopping, you pay for it, and then you just have to trust that it comes. You got to trust that it gets delivered. You got to trust that it's what you ordered, that it's the quality that you hope for, or that's being like promoted. You just got to trust it. So the exporter receives the payment. The online shopping place is going to get your payment first. And after they've got that payment, then you're getting your confirmation email. Then you're getting your AusPost delivery, we're coming at this time, text, and then you're going to get your good. So the payment exposes the exporter to no risk. And when you're online shopping, Shein and all that aren't at any risk because you've already paid them. They've got their money. You're at all the risk because you've already sent them the money and you haven't even received the goods yet. So it's exactly the same for exporters and importers. Not many importers are agreeing to this method because there's a high risk because they're sending all this money, especially when it's suppliers and you're buying like hundreds of thousands of dollars of goods. You're putting a lot of trust overseas to some company that there's no guarantee you're going to even get what you ordered on time in the quality that you ordered, etc. So payment in advance is risky for the importer, just like online shopping is risky for us because you don't know that you're going to get it on time, that you're going to get it at all. Some people just never get their item, or that you're going to get what you asked for and what you paid for. But for the exporter, it's great because they get all their money. Doesn't matter how you feel, they got their cash, they're on the way. So if you're struggling with some of these, I feel like applying them and putting them in terms that fit your understanding. And for me, it had to be online shopping. I am consistently shopping. That's what worked for me. Now, letter of credit is where the document, a buyer requests it from their bank that guarantees the payment of good will be transferred to the letter once they've to the seller, and once they've committed to that, the buyer can't withdraw. So what that is, if I was going to buy, let's say I wanted to buy 100K worth of clothes for my clothing company, because apparently I want to keep using the clothing company example. If I wanted to buy 100K worth of clothes from a supply in Singapore, I would go to Commonwealth Bank and I'd be like, hey, I want to buy this amount of clothes from Singapore. Can you sign this letter of credit and help me out with this? So Commonwealth will then sign that letter, and they're going to send it to the exporter, and that letter promises that at a specific time they're going to pay them once certain conditions are met. So those conditions might be as soon as we've gotten confirmation that the goods have left the country, as soon as we've gotten confirmation that the clothes have like entered Australia. There can be all different conditions. It really just depends on what that letter is, but the bank has signed that. So what that means that if the buyer fails to make the payment, the bank has to cover the purchase. So if a month later I'm like, you know what, I actually found a cheap supplier, I'm not doing this. First of all, the bank is forced to pay it. So no matter what, the exporter is going to get their money. But then you know what banks are like. Banks aren't just going to let you decide and like pull out of something that you've legally signed. That's like a legal document now. The bank is going to come chase you up and you have to cover that purchase. So the issue with letter of credit for buyers is that as soon as you sign that letter, you're stuck. Like you are stuck and like sucked into this deal. It's popular with exporters though, because they rely on overseas banks rather than the importer. From that Singapore company, they don't have to rely on some random 19-year-old who wants to buy 100K of clothes. They can rely on one of Australia's biggest banks who have signed it and agreed to it. So it is popular for them and it's less riskier for the exporter. But for me as a buyer, it is risky because I'm stuck in that deal. It's less risky, however, than the payment in advance because at least some conditions can be met. Clean payment is online shopping to a T. This is the difference. So payment, is the opposite of online shopping. So payment in advance is online shopping. Clean payment reminds me of when we normally go to the shops. So when you normally go to the shops, you get the good, you get to try it on, you grab it, and then you pay for it. Same when you get like a service done. So if you get your nails done, you go get a haircut, that you get that service done and then you're paying for it after. And this is exactly like clean payments. So for clean payment, the exporter, so that company from Singapore is sending me my clothes first and then they get their payment. So I'm getting my clothes first and then I'm going to send them the payment. So the importer, so I'm not going to pay them until I receive my goods. And on top of that, the exporter is requesting an invoice and they're going to give me 30, 60 or 90 days to pay that back. That's really great for me because I get my product first. I get to make sure it gets here on time and it's the order that I ordered, and then I'm secure with it. And I'm like, okay, I'll pay for it. Just like when I go shopping or when I go get my hair done, I get my hair done first. I get to see the result and then I'm like, okay, all good. I'll pay you. That's different with online shopping where you have to just trust the good before it gets here. So it's advantageous for the importer, but it's only going to be used by the exporter if the exporter is confident that the importer is going to pay. So it's got a lot of trust with you got to have trust in the importer, because as an exporter from that company for Singapore, for example, they have to really trust that I'm going to pay that money because they're sending me all their goods. How do you know that I'm going to pay it? And especially because it's overseas and you're dealing with language barriers, financial differences and fluctuations in currency and exchange rates and interest rates. There's so much going on. So chasing up payments is definitely difficult with the barriers of like globalization and distance. So this method isn't too popular among exporters, and it only is going to be popular if they're confident or if it's someone that they supply with often and that they trust. And lastly is a bill of exchange. Now this can either be a document against payment where the exporter demands that the importer can only collect the goods after paying, or that the importer may collect the goods before paying. This bill of exchange is commonly used because the exporter gets to maintain control over the goods until the payment has been made, and it's kind of more on their terms, so it's less riskier for them. But again, if they choose to document against acceptance where I can't get my goods until I pay, the document against payment where I can't get my goods until I pay, that's a risk. While document against acceptance where I may collect them before paying, that's a good one. So it really just depends with everything. Each of them are going to affect the exporter and the importer differently. This is the risk for the exporter, and obviously it's going to be the opposite for the importer. But I hope that makes sense. Please ask questions. I know this is actually really hard. I struggled to sit with this for a while. Like, I had to sit with these notes, and I had to just keep asking my teacher to re-explain again and again for all of global financial management, just because, again, I wasn't doing economics, and my common sense in that area just isn't really switched on. I'm still trying to understand Australian money, Australian math. Can't grab on that. So I think that if you're still finding this difficult after that explanation, that is completely fine. With time, it'll sink in. Definitely ask your teachers about it. Try to talk about it and read it up as much as you can on them, just so it sinks in. But yeah, for me, understanding that payment in advance and clean payment were just like online shopping in comparison to real shopping, those real life examples were really helping me. Now, the last part of this is hedging and derivatives. So the issue is, when I was doing hedging and derivatives, I really thought they were different things, but derivatives is just the tool to achieve hedging. So hedging is the process of minimizing the risk of currency fluctuations. So currency fluctuations is, like I was saying, like maybe right now our dollar against UK is really bad, but then UK, something happens in a few months, their dollar goes up dramatically, and now like it cost me triple, 4 times, 5 times as much. That's at a risk, and that can really affect me. So to get over that, we use derivatives. So derivatives are the financial instruments that you use to lessen the risk, while hedging is just the process. So hedging is the process of minimizing the risk, and to act upon that process, you're going to use derivatives. So there's 3 different derivatives that you can use. You can use a forward exchange contract, which is a contract to exchange one currency for another currency at an agreed exchange rate on a future date. And that's usually 30, 90, or 100 days after. That's got that agreed exchange rate. So whether or not it changes, they've still got that set exchange rate, and it's agreed upon. So it's much safer in terms of being at risk of the fluctuating one. And this is where the bank's involved. So the bank is actually going to guarantee the exporter that within a set time, a fixed rate of exchange for the money generated from the sale of exports is going to be made. There's the options contract, which gives the buyer, who's the option holder, the right but not the obligation to buy or sell foreign currency at some time in the future, and it's protected from unfavorable exchange rate fluctuations because they've got that right, but it's still like an option. It's not actually an obligation to buy it. And then they've got the swap contract, which is an agreement to exchange currency in the spot market with an agreement to reverse the transaction in the future. So you can exchange the currency right now, but there is that spot sale that you can do to repurchase it at that same rate at a future date. So it's advantageous to businesses because they can alter their exposure to exchange fluctuations without discarding original transactions and then go back to old transactions where there was a better exchange rate currency. It's all just like swapping, and you're just deciding which agreement you're going to use on the spot market. But that is the end, guys. I hope you guys have a great holidays. I know that was a run-in. I'm so sorry. If you have not done finance yet, this was probably a little bit intimidating. But again, in this presentation, we went through the hardest topics. Again, a lot of that content was within an hour and a half, and you guys are going to get most of this term. And if you've already studied it, you've already had probably nearly a whole term to study finance. So this was very much just a summary. I really hope it helped you out. I hope that there's been questions in the live chat and we've been able to talk, and I can help you guys throughout. But otherwise, I wish you all the best in business studies. I hope that as you guys go throughout the year, you can implement some different study techniques, come back to these slides, use some of these notes, and that you guys had some good takeaways from here. I wish you so much luck. I think that business studies is such a game changer as long as you're studying the right way for it and you have a good mindset with it. Remember that scaling isn't necessarily bad for it as long as you're not falling into the average. And the fact that you guys are going out of your way to sign up for these 800 lectures, like I just know. I just know that none of us are falling into the average. All the best with your studies and with your other subjects too. But yeah, thanks for coming, guys.